Welcome back to the Bits of Good Bootcamp. In this video, we're going to talk about conditional rendering with React. So first of all, let's kind of talk about what that means. And really what happens here is there's some situations where we want to render a component, but only some of the time. And so what we can do there in that case is whatever that behavior is that we sometimes needs to occur and sometimes doesn't, we can encapsulate that in a component. And then we can use conditional rendering to decide when that component should be rendered and when it shouldn't. And really, it's pretty similar to what we would do just using JavaScript. We either would use an if operator or a ternary operator. So let's get into some examples. So here what we're doing is we're just using an if statement. And so here on the left, we have our two types of components here. These are really simple functional and presentational components. One is showing a welcome back, and one is showing a please sign up message. And then this greeting component here is actually, it's rendering either the user greeting or the guest greeting. That's the only thing that it's rendering. It doesn't have any other HTML tags. It's just rendering either this component or that component. And so based on the props, whether or not a user is logged in, it will return either user greeting or guest greeting. This is pretty simple. But I think we should just take a look at a CodePen example just to make sure that everybody feels comfortable with it. So we actually need to change a variable here. There's no button in this example, but you can see while this is false, greeting is saying if false, and then it's returning the guest greeting. So if I change this to true, we'll see that it actually goes ahead and returns the user greeting, which is welcome back. So this is a pretty simple example showing you how you could use an if statement to conditionally render either one component or another. Oops, let's close that and let's go back to our slides. So another thing that we can do to conditionally render is we can actually store components inside of variables and then use those variables as something that can be rendered. So first of all, I just want to introduce these two components here, login button and logout button. Obviously, they're very similar to each other. Really, the only difference is whether it's showing login or logout in this case. But functionally, the rest of the component is basically the same. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use these two components to create another component that we'll call login control. And it will show either the login button or the logout button, as well as a greeting depending on the situation. Let's dive in. So this is a little bit more code, so let's kind of step through it. At the beginning here, we have our login controller. This is our class definition. And we have our constructor. Of course, we're calling the super. And then we are binding our two event handlers here. Remember, this is very, very important. And you will basically see this in every single component that has event handlers. This is always going to be in the constructor. And then we are declaring our state. And initially, we're saying that we are not logged in. False. We are not logged in. Okay, and then here we have our two handlers. And these are just changing a part of the state. And then finally, we have our render function. And note here, this is our element variable, let button. And so button is just going to be a variable that is going to store a component. And now, similarly to what we've seen before, we have an if statement. And inside the if statement, we are setting button to equal either the logout button or the login button. And then note we are also passing in the proper click handler for both buttons. And then finally, in the return part of our render function, we are returning some HTML and then also a greeting. So this was our greeting component that we had seen before. And then here, notice we have the curly brackets and then button. And so what's going to happen here, because we're using curly brackets inside of JSX, this part here is JSX, of course. Actually, this whole part down here really is JSX. But because we're using curly brackets, whatever's inside the curly brackets is going to be evaluated. And then it will render either the login button or the logout button, depending on what it was set to up here. And yeah, that's about it for this example. Let's dive into a CodePen, see it in the flesh. Okay, here we go. Now, so I'm going to click the login button, and it's going to show us welcome back, and then log out, log in, log out. Yeah, I think it's pretty simple here. You should just convince yourself that this is kind of like the key piece of the code where the button is being set, this variable is being set based on the logged in, depending on, and it's setting the button properly. And then here, this is also pretty cool. We're using JSX to just display the button, right? It's important to note that this would not be correct, right? That's not what we're trying to do, but we're actually using the JSX operator here. So yeah, that's an important thing to note. Okay, let's go back to our slides. And another thing that we might want to do, this example is kind of a little messy. You know, it's taking up a lot of room, we're doing a lot of things, and even in the example before where we were just doing an if, this only really works for very simple cases, and it can be messy when things get complicated. One of my preferred ways actually is to use either the logical and operator or a ternary expression, which we'll get to in a second. So let's take a look at what happens here with the logical and operator. And so we have another component here, we're calling it mailbox, and then it's going to take some unread messages, and if we have unread messages, it's going to tell us how many unread messages we have. So we're going to look here, and the first thing we have here, so note we have a curly brace. So remember, everything inside of the curly brace is going to be evaluated as JavaScript. And so unread messages dot length greater than or equal to 0. So this is going to be a truthy or falsy value, right? Depending on how this evaluates, depending on the length of unread messages. So if this is true, then we're going to continue through the and sign, and then this is actually going to be returned. And so this is just behavior of JavaScript. When you have an and operator, if the first element is true, the second element, regardless of whether or not it's true or false, is going to be returned. The last element will always be returned. And then the other side of this is that if unread messages.length greater than 0 is false, it will actually just stop there, right? It's going to short circuit because that's how and operators work. And so this is going to just return false because that's what this expression evaluates to. And that isn't going to render on the screen. And so we're not even going to get to this H2, and that will not be rendered. Okay, I think we should dive into a CodePen example here, and I think that will be cool to see this work. Okay, so we have here exactly what we would expect. So we have our messages array, which includes 3 messages here. And so because it includes 3 messages, we should expect that this evaluates to true, and then the H2 is actually rendered. But, for example, if I were to make another thing here, and I'm just going to make this an empty array, so now what we're going to have, actually let me just comment at this line. Now what we're going to have is that this just says hello, because here, unread messages.length, this is evaluating to false, and so this is never being hit. Okay? So because this first expression evaluates to false, this second expression never gets rendered. And then when the first expression evaluates to true, the second expression will then be rendered. So this is a pretty cool way to be able to control what should be rendered on the screen by evaluating some JavaScript expression, and then depending on the truthiness or falsiness value of that, displaying some HTML. Or a component would also be fine to display here. Okay, we just have one more example of how to handle conditional rendering, so let's dive into that. And the way that we're going to do this is finally with a ternary expression, or an if-else conditional operator, if that's how you prefer to name it. So here you can see that this is pretty straightforward. We have our curly brackets again, and then the way that a ternary expression works is we have a condition first, followed by a question mark, and then if the condition is true, the first item after the question mark will be rendered, but if the condition was false, then the second item after the colon here will be rendered. And so here we say the user is, and then either, depending on whether the truthiness or falsiness value of this is either currently or not logged in. So I think that's a pretty standard example. And it can actually also be used for more complicated things. So here we were just using it kind of in line of a render function to properly inject either the word currently or the word not. So this is a pretty basic example. In this example, we're actually using it to decide which button to render. So this is kind of something familiar. You should recognize this from a component we saw earlier. And so based on this is logged in value, we'll either be rendering the logout button or the login button. So this is a really cool way to decide if you have 2 components and they both hinge on the same condition about whether or not they should be rendered. This ternary expression is a terrific way to be able to handle that in a succinct way. It can be a little confusing here with what's going on with all these parentheses and stuff. It doesn't look super clean, but it's still really useful. And then we also might want to prevent a component from rendering. And so in this example, what we're actually doing is we're not controlling whether or not the component renders inside of like a return, inside of the render function or something like that. But in this example, the warning banner has already been rendered by another component, by a parent component. The parent has made the decision, I'm going to render the warning banner. But inside of the warning banner, we still have one last-ditch effort to decide within the warning banner component what it will return, and then that in turn will decide what it renders. And so here what we're doing is we're actually going to hide the warning banner when there's no props.warn being passed in. And so the way we're doing that is just returning null. And so when warning banner it's rendered depending on the value of the prop called warn, and if the value of the prop is false, then the component does not render. But if the value of this is true, then this if expression does not get evaluated, and then we just have our normal warning. Now the next thing we're going to see here is actually like the full example of this warning banner. And so again, this is a little bit of a lot of code, so let's kind of break it apart. So at the top here, we have just our warning banner, right? So this is what we saw in the last slide. And then after this point, we have a whole nother component called page. And then page, inside of page's render function, it is always rendering the warning banner. You can see here that there is no kind of conditional rendering logic happening inside of page. It is just every single time showing the warning banner. So therefore, it becomes the responsibility of the warning banner to only show itself when it is supposed to, when there is actually a warning. And so the way that is happening here is what we talked about before. Based on the value of props.warn, it's either going to return null or it's going to return the warning. So let's go ahead and let's check out the code pen. Okay, so here we have, let me pull this aside so we can see a little bit better. Again, we have our first component, right? And this is doing what we already explained. And then we have our page component. And then based on, when I click this button, it's going to set the value of show warning to false. And that is what is being passed into warning banner as the warn prop. And so when I click this and this changes to false, then what we're going to see here is that warning banner is actually going to kind of short circuit here and just return null instead. And I'm just going to put in console log, short circuit, and return null, just so we can see this happening in real time. So you see it's short circuited, and it comes back, and now it's short circuited, now it comes back. Okay. Oops. So those are all the ways that we were going to go over as far as conditional rendering. And yeah, I guess one thing to note real quick here, it's not super important in this example, but it might be just a good thing to know going forward. And that's this note here. Returning null from a component's render method does not affect any of the other lifecycle functions. So here we're returning null, but this component doesn't actually have any other lifecycle functions, so this example is not really indicative of what this note is talking about. But if, for example, warning banner might have like a component did update or a component will unmount function or something like that, those are still going to be executed regardless of whether or not you return null. All right, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.